Great. Well, thank you so much for having me. Can you hear me okay in the back? Great. So I direct the Concepts in Cognition Lab, a cognitive psychology laboratory at UC Berkeley. And what I try to do in my research is to bridge philosophy and psychology. And in particular, a lot of the research that we do takes questions that are traditionally philosophical, and we try to address them using some of the tools of contemporary cognitive psychology in order to create a seamless hybrid that allows us to both try to give a good descriptive characterization of the human mind, but also to think about the philosophical implications of what we find out about human cognition. What I'm going to tell you about today is a tiny bit about one of the main strands of work in my lab, which has to do with explanation. So we're all really motivated to explain. This takes up a lot of our cognitive lives and a lot of our cognitive energy, and I'm interested in why this is. And explanation is a topic that philosophers of science have thought about and psychologists have thought about as well. So since we're talking about explanation, I think an appropriate place to start is with a question. And the question I want to start with comes from the annual question of the year from the website edge.org, which some of you might be familiar with. Every year they pose a question to dozens of artists and scientists and thinkers of various kinds. And fortunately for me, the question for 2012 was, what is your favorite deep, elegant, or beautiful explanation? They received nearly 200 responses from all sorts of people, including many who you're likely to recognize, including some people around this area here. And what was really fascinating for me was that in one way, these responses were incredibly diverse. So some people appealed to psychology, others to quantum mechanics and to evolutionary biology, and so on. Despite this diversity, there was actually something that was common to a lot of these, and that had to do with what it was that people took to make something a good explanation, what it was that people justified and appealed to justify what it was that made their explanation beautiful, elegant, or deep. And in particular, one of the things that you see over and over again if you read these responses is people appealing to something like Occam's razor, right? Some notion of simplicity or parsimony. So if you just do a simple word count on these responses, the word simplicity appears more than 50 times, the word simple more than 100. Another idea that it comes up over and over again is the idea that people like explanations that are broad, that have a property I'm going to refer to as scope. We don't just want our explanations to account for some small little idiosyncratic phenomenon. We want them to really generalize or tell us about lots of aspects of the world. So to quote one of the responses, the hallmark of a deep explanation is that it answers more than you ask, which is, I think, a really nice way to capture this idea that when we're trying to explain, we're really looking for something that generalizes, right? Something about the pattern that something fits into. Now, both of these ideas, that we prefer explanations that are simple and that have broad scope, have a deep history in philosophy and in science. So here's a quote that I like from the philosopher of science, Weigel, writing that the aim of scientific explanation throughout the ages has been unification, which he defines as the comprehending of a maximum of facts and regularities, so there you get some notion of scope or breadth, in terms of a minimum of theoretical concepts and assumptions. So there we have some notion of parsimony or simplicity. And it turns out that it isn't just philosophers who think about these sorts of ideas related to explanation. You also find scientists appealing to very similar sorts of ideas. So Newton, just to give one example, suggests that you should admit no more causes of phenomena than such as are both true and sufficient to explain their appearances. And in the kind of research that I do, we're finding that sort of everyday adults and children without any particular philosophical or scientific training also seem to have systematic preferences for explanations that are simple and that have broad scope. Now this raises the first of three mysteries of explanation that I want to tell you about today. And the first mystery is why it is that we're so picky about explanations. Right? We don't just want explanations. We have really strong opinions about what makes something a good explanation or a bad explanation. And in particular, we seem to have systematic preferences for explanations that are simple and broad. Right? So why is this? This is, I think, sort of a puzzle. Why we should have these particular systematic preferences. The second puzzle comes from the observation that when we seek explanations, it's typically for things that have already occurred or for observations that we have already made. So to illustrate this, I just want to give you some examples of cases where people have sought explanations And to look for these, I went to Yahoo Answers, which some of you are probably familiar with. This is a website where people can post questions and answers and evaluate them and so on. It's one of many such sites now that exist on the internet. And if you go to Yahoo Answers, you'll find all sorts of questions. And here are just a couple. Why did dinosaurs become extinct? Why did the Spanish-American War start? Now, in this case, we already know that the dinosaurs went extinct. We already know that this war occurred, right? So why are we trying to explain them, right? Explanation is sort of backwards looking in this funny way, where we already know what it is we're trying to explain. Now, it's really clear why it would be useful and important to be able to predict which species are going to become extinct, or to be able to predict whether or not a war is going to occur. But given that it's already occurred, why are we engaged in this process of trying to look backwards and figure out what happened? We also do this for very mundane things. In fact, if you start eavesdropping on your friends, you'll realize that a pretty high proportion of our everyday conversations are about explaining our own and other people's behavior. And we also do this for explaining patterns or generalizations. So for example, why do dogs have tails? When you ask this question, clearly you've already noticed this regularity in the world, that dogs tend to have tails, right? You've already made that observation. What's the extra thing you get by being able to explain it? Or why do we stereotype, for example? Okay, so the second puzzle here is why explanation tends to have this sort of post hoc character, this backwards-looking character, where we've already observed something, right? Why are we trying to explain? What's the extra benefit or value that we get from explaining something when we already know that it occurred or we've already noticed a particular trend? Now, you might have some ideas about why this could be valuable, and I want to sort of articulate what those might be, and also suggest that that actually leads us to the third mystery of explanation. So what you might have already thought about, because I think it's a fairly intuitive idea, is that seeking explanations might be valuable because it allows us to learn. It motivates us to learn something about what we're trying to explain. So I think this was put really nicely by my colleague here at UC Berkeley, psychologist Elsa Gopnik, in a provocatively titled paper called Explanation as Orgasm. She writes that explanation is to theory formation as orgasm is to reproduction. It's the phenomenological mark of the fulfillment of an evolutionarily determined drive. All right, so what does she mean here? Well, there's a certain phenomenology or experience that's associated with finding a satisfying explanation. All right, we're very motivated to get explanations, and there's that satisfying aha moment when you understand something and you've just found an explanation. So her idea is that part of the reason why explanation has this particular kind of phenomenological character is because that motivates us to engage in a behavior that's evolutionarily advantageous. And that behavior is the behavior of seeking explanations that allow us to figure out the causal structure of the world. And by figuring out the causal structure of the world, we're then going to be in a better position to be able to predict and control things in the future. One other nice articulation of this idea, that explanations are going to be valuable because they allow us to do something that's more forward-looking, namely to predict and control things, comes from the philosopher William von Orman Quine, writing here with Ullin in The Web of Belief. He writes, "The hypotheses we seek an explanation of past observations serve again in the prediction of future ones. Curiosity thus has survival value despite having killed a cat." Right? So even though explanations on the face of it have this very sort of post hoc character where we're explaining the past, it seems like part of the reason that's valuable is because we're going to learn something that then prepares us for the future. Okay. To motivate the third mystery, I want to think a little bit about the different ways in which we can learn by explaining. So I think canonically when we think about learning by explaining, you might imagine that there's something you don't know, somebody explains it to you, you've now learned something new. But there's actually a deeply interesting and somewhat more mysterious way that we learn by explaining. And it's by doing what psychologists sometimes refer to as self-explaining. And this comes from something called the self-explanation effect, which is basically the phenomenon that when students explain to themselves, even when they don't receive feedback, they tend to learn material better and to generalize it to novel contexts more effectively than when they don't. So for example, psychologists have done experiments with, say, middle school students learning math, and they'll give the students worked out examples of mathematical problems. And half of them will be told to explain to themselves while they work through this material. And the other half will be told to do something else, like to read the materials twice or to think out loud. And pretty reliably you'll find that those who explain to themselves learn better. And probably this is an experience that most of you have actually had, right? So if you've ever taught a class, if you've ever, as a parent, explained something to a child, if you've ever explained in other contexts, or simply tried to explain something to yourself, you've probably had the experience of coming to understand something better as a result of explaining it to somebody else. And I think this is a deeply familiar experience, so we sort of take it for granted. But I think it's actually also really mysterious, because when you explain to yourself, you're not getting new information from the external world, right? You're sort of rearranging what's already in your head in a way that somehow leads you to new insight or understanding. So it looks like it's a special case of learning. And I think the way to bring this out is to contrast it with the more canonical cases of learning that I think we tend to think about when we think about how learning works. So one of those is learning from observations, right? You might observe something in the world and come to learn something new. Another is learning from testimony, a special case of observation when somebody tells you something. And in both of these cases, it looks like the way learning occurs is that something from the external world makes it into your head, generating some insight. In the case of learning from testimony, something that somebody else knew makes it into your head, and so you generate new insight. And in learning by explaining, somehow you rearrange what was already there in a way that generates new insight. And so that takes us to this third puzzle, which is how explaining can be productive in this way. Where what I mean is, how is it that explanations can support learning, even in the absence of new information? Now, this property isn't unique to explanations, but the sorts of cases where people have really thought about this before are cases of thought experiments. So if you think about the way a thought experiment in science works, someone like Einstein can sit in his armchair and think about traveling on a beam of light, or in an elevator, on a train, or there's Schrodinger thinking about a cat. These are cases where it seems like there was a genuine insight or advance in the history of science that came not from an experiment that generated new data from the world, but really from an experiment in the mind that led to some important conceptual advance. Now, of course, this isn't the way that science typically advances, right? These are exceptional cases. But there are at least some cases that suggest that we can get genuine insight from this type of process. And it's also a process that happens all the time in philosophy. So if any of you have taken coursework in philosophy or more informally encountered philosophy, philosophers constantly generate thought experiments to explore ideas in ethics, in philosophy of mind, in metaphysics, and all sorts of areas. There's famous thought experiments involving twin Earths, and zombies, and brains in vats, and trolley car problems that have gotten lots of press lately, so you might have heard of those. And again, these are cases where it seems like some of the time from your armchair, without any new data from the external world, you can come to some genuinely new insight or understanding that you didn't have before. Okay, so how do we study this empirically? How can we start to understand what it is that's going on when you learn by explaining, by studying it systematically in the lab using the tools of cognitive psychology? So what I want to do is to very briefly give you a sense for the kinds of experiments that we do around these issues. And for this first one, I'm going to need your help to replicate a phenomenon that we found. Well, actually, just to get a hint for it. So if you were a participant in this experiment, you would be told that your task is to learn to differentiate glorps and drents. These are two kinds of robots from an alien planet. I'm going to show you some new robots later, you'd be told, and you're going to have to tell me if they're glorps or drents. So you need to figure out what it is that makes something a glorp or a drent. Any guesses?
They're square.
Great. Okay, so we have one pattern, which somebody's noticed, which I'm going to refer to the 75% body pattern. So there is a real regularity here, which is that glorps tend to be square and drents tend to be round. But in each case, there's one exception. So if you use that pattern, you would correctly classify 75% of these robots, but there'd be some exceptions. Yes?
Glorps have pointy feet?
Great, and that is the 100% foot pattern, which is designed to be more subtle. So for those of you who didn't figure it out, don't feel bad. Our participants get more time with this. So even though all of these robots have unique foot shapes, all of the drents have feet that are flat along the bottom, and all of the glorps have feet that are pointy along the bottom. And if you figured this out, you'd actually be able to classify all 8 of these correctly. So we call this the 100% foot pattern. Okay, now here's the way the experiment works. Participants are first shown these 8 robots. Like you saw them, they're told that they should learn to classify these into 2 groups. They then have a chance to study them individually And here's the critical manipulation. For half the participants, they're told to explain why it is that that particular robot might be a glorp or a drent. And they're not given any feedback on their explanation. They're just told, explain why this might be the case. Participants in the control condition do something else. And across experiments, we've changed whether they describe the robot, they think aloud while studying it, they just study it freely, they study for a matched amount of time. We've done lots of things across different experiments. We then give them new robots and have them classify them as glorps or drents to figure out which features they're using for classification. And we ask them explicitly, what do you think makes something a glorp or a drent? And we can analyze a lot of aspects of these data, but in particular, I'm going to show you what happens when we classify what they tell us makes something a glorp or a drent to see whether or not they discovered the foot pattern and they discovered the body pattern. Okay, well, what should we predict? Well, if trying to explain makes you look for things that are simple and broad, that's going to actually influence what kind of structure you're looking for in the data as you study, what it is that makes something a satisfying answer to the question of what makes something a glorp or a drent. To the extent you want something simple and broad, the foot pattern is going to be better than the body pattern, right? And so the prediction here is that just telling people to explain is going to actually influence what it is they learn. And they're going to be more likely to discover that than participants who don't explain. Again, even though everyone gets the same data, everyone gets the same instructions in terms of what their task is to classify these, and so on. And that's what we find reliably across the studies I'll show you here and additional experiments as well. So when we compare explaining to describing, we find there's like a, in that case, I think like a fourfold increase in how likely people are to discover this foot pattern. Similar data when we compare explaining to thinking aloud or to free study. Pretty reliably, just telling people to explain changes what it is that they discover and what it is that they generalize about the materials that you showed them. We also find this with preschool-age children. So in order to do it with preschool-age children, we moved away from glorps and drents to try to do something that would work a little bit better. So they learned about this device called a blicket detector. There are some objects that go on it and make it go, and other objects that don't. So if you were a 5-year-old in our study, you would see something like this. That when this object goes on the machine, it plays music. When this object goes on the machine, nothing happens. They would see 8 objects. Anybody notice patterns here? All right, so a little bit less subtle than the adult version, but the logic is the same.
Dark green and the yellow.
Exactly, great. So there's a 100% rule here and a 75% rule, just like in the previous experiment I showed you. The 100% pattern is the one that was just identified, which is about green versus yellow. And there's also this red versus white pattern, where there's a real correlation between red versus white and activating the machine, but it captures less of the data. It has more limited scope. What we do now is we ask half the kids, as they see each object go onto the machine, we say, why did this one make my machine play music? Or why did this one not make my machine play music? And for the other half of the kids, we say, what happened when this one went on a machine? What happened when this one went on my machine? So they can just tell us it played music or it didn't. This is supposed to control for their attention, requiring a verbal response, and so on, but they're not actually asked to explain. And here what we find is that if we then present them with a task that pits one rule against the other, we find that there's a difference across conditions. So what we do is we have an experimenter, for example, look at an opaque bag and say, I see a green one and I see a red one. Which one will make my machine turn on? Okay, now both of those features have been associated with making the machine turn on, but if explaining has made them favor one of these patterns more than the other, the kids who were prompted to explain should be significantly more likely to say that the green one will make the machine go. And that's what we find in this task. So again, all participants see the same data, they're not given any feedback on their explanations, but just being prompted to explain changes what it is that they learn and generalize. Okay. So
you wanted the 2 minutes.
2 minutes, thank you. All right. So in these kinds of cases, all participants see the same data. So it's a little different from a canonical case like a thought experiment where no data is involved at all. But the only thing that we manipulate across participants is whether or not they have this instruction to explain to themselves, and that has an impact on learning. And this is a phenomenon that in my lab we've been referring to as learning by thinking, which is exhibited by explaining to yourself, but also thought experiments and a variety of other kinds of everyday cognitive processes. So the last thing I want to do is to suggest that these 3 mysteries of explanation are actually all related. And the picture looks something like this. there's a lot of data in the world, right? There's lots of stuff that we learn that we're constantly picking up on, statistical regularities in the environment and so on. But if we just have it in this form, that's not very useful. What we really want to know about are things like semantic relationships, the relationships between different variables, how things are causally related to each other, how things form categories, right? That's the kind of information that's actually useful, that's going to allow us to use this data in a way that supports intelligent behavior. So how are we going to get from this unstructured data to sort of usable, interestingly structured information about, say, causal relationships, patterns, and regularities? Well, the idea is that one thing that explanation does is it basically imposes constraints on what kind of structure you're looking for and how it is that you structure the information that you already have. And those constraints come from pickiness, right? We like things that are simple in particular ways. We like things that have broad scope. So that's where the pickiness comes in. That's where the constraints come on how it is that we process information. The fact that explanation is post hoc is not necessarily a bad thing in this sense, because we want to be able to use lots of data, whether it's our prior experience that we've already observed, novel observations as they're coming in, and so on. So we're going to make use of all of the stuff that we've already observed. We're going to recruit these sort of evaluative criteria about what it is that makes something a good explanation. And as a result of combining those two things, we're going to get productivity. We're going to be able to extract some structure from that data in a way that's going to take this unstructured mess going into our heads and produce something which is more useful to actually guide our behavior. So this, I want to suggest, is true not just in the lab, but also plays a role in science, and is one of the reasons why looking for scientific explanations plays such an important role in scientific progress. It might also help explain certain kinds of preferences within science, right? We really seem to like these grand unified theories that account for everything. And the kind of data that I've shown you hopefully also convinces you that this might play a role in everyday reasoning by both adults and by children. Now, speculatively, this will sometimes go wrong in the real world. So we actually have cases in the lab where we've shown that, like the cases I showed you, prompting people to explain actually improves learning. We also have cases where prompting people to explain actually leads them systematically astray. So in particular, if explaining makes you want something simple and broad, then if you present people with cases where there is nothing simple and broad to learn, you know, the world in the lab is just messy, then prompting them to explain will actually make them perseverate in looking for nice patterns and do worse at learning than people who are not prompted to explain. And so speculatively, you might think that this happens in the real world in something like a conspiracy theory, right? If you think about what happens in a conspiracy theory, you're trying to find some single unified account of a whole bunch of disparate bits of data, right? And some of the time, it's just the case that it's a coincidence that those 10 things occurred, right? But sometimes we're really driven to find some single or a small set of unifying things to account for a broad range of data. So less speculatively, though, I hope to have at least convinced you that we really do have this deep drive to explain, that it's psychologically and I think also philosophically interesting to try to understand it, and that something we take for granted, the fact that we learn by explaining to ourselves, is actually deeply interesting and can tell us interesting things about the way human learning works. Thank you.